It's a great pleasure again to welcome Ernest Lucas, who is going to give his second lecture of the course. Ernest was formerly the Vice Principal of Bristol Baptist College. He has a background also in science. He's one of those people with PhD in both science and Oriental Studies. And he spent a long time talking about what he's going to talk about today. I mean, he talked about yesterday reading the Bible in the light of contemporary science. So over to you, Ernest.
Thank you, Marie. During the Meet the Speaker session on Monday, someone asked me the question, well, where can the ordinary person get the kind of information about cultural background, the ancient Near East and so on that I was using in my presentation? And it's only after I realised I'd forgotten a very important source, which I shouldn't have forgotten because I contributed to it. You may be used to Bible commentaries, which go in detail on the text and the grammar and the syntax and so on. There is a variety of biblical commentary called background commentaries. Two I know particularly. One is produced by IVP, the IVP Bible Background Commentary. It's in 2 volumes, Old Testament and New Testament. And rather than going into the details of the text, it's filling in the cultural historical background. There's a larger, more lavish version of that in the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Background Commentary. Zondervan Illustrated Bible Background Commentary, which is multi-volume. There are 4 volumes on the Old Testament, one of which I contributed to, the background commentary on Daniel, and I think it's 2 volumes on the New Testament. As the illustrated means, that's why it's so much bigger. Lots and lots of pictures, much more expensive, of course. But the good news is that it is available in a digital form, which is a lot cheaper. So do search for that if you're interested. I do encourage places like churches and synagogues and so on not to have libraries. To put these things in so that their members who can't afford to buy them can borrow them. Anyway, the Bible background commentaries are worth looking for to give you background on history, culture, and things like that. Well, on Monday we talked about Genesis 1. Today we come to Genesis 2 and 3. And just to remind you that I was suggesting on Monday that any text, and particularly applies to the biblical text, should be approached using what I call the principle of incarnation, particularly opposite for those coming from a Christian tradition, that the message is incarnated in the history, culture, background of the setting of the person who brings the message. And we were looking at Genesis 1 against the background of ancient Greek and creation stories. So we'll continue to do that in chapters 2 and 3, where we have another creation story. And I suggested there were these questions which were worth using because they are a way in to getting at how the message is incarnated in the text. So these 5 questions, and we'll go through them with regard to Genesis 2 and 3 the way we did with Genesis 1. So what kind of language is being used? What kind of literature is this? What's the expected audience and what's the purpose? That question, to some degree, is answered by answering the first 3 questions. What relevant knowledge from outside the text is there that might help us to understand it? Well, if we ask the question, what kind of language Genesis 2 and 3 written in, there is a general agreement that it contains a lot of figurative language of a particular type called anthropomorphic language. That's using the metaphor, if you like, drawn from human experience. The anthro bit there means human, not just man, in the male sense. And certainly that's true of the language that's used of the Lord God in the story. The Lord God forms man from the dust. And the verb that's used there in Hebrew, yatzar, is a verb that elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible is used, for instance, of a potter or a sculpture, shaping, forming something. So God forms man from the dust of the ground and then breathes into his nostrils. And I envisage that a bit like giving a kiss of life. And that is sort of implying God has a nose, a mouth, and is bringing this shape alive by giving it the kind of kiss of life. And then God plants a garden. That's unlike chapter 1, where God speaks and there are trees and plants on the earth. the word planted is used, as you're talking about a horticulturalist or a farmer planting a plot of ground. And of course, later in chapter 3, God walks in the garden. And this anthropomorphic language, human-like language, is not only used of God, of course, we have a talking serpent in the garden. Now, the fact that it is so full of figurative anthropomorphic language is what led Origen, who we looked at last time in his comment on Genesis 1, to see that as a clue, a key to the kind of literature that this story is. That it is figurative literature. Who could be found so silly as to believe that God, after the manner of a farmer, planted trees in the paradise, eastward in Eden? I mean, if God is said to walk in the paradise in the evening, I don't think anyone will doubt that these are figurative expressions which indicate certain mysteries through a semblance of history. So he's saying it looks like a historical account, if you like, in one sense, but that's what it looks like, but in fact it's a figurative story which is conveying certain mystery, which means theological truth. It's primarily a theological story, and it's not to be read as a historical account. Now, if we come up to modern literary studies, jumping 18 centuries, it's been pointed out by modern biblical scholars looking at the story that it has an interesting and particular shape. Technically it's called a chiasmus. I use the language, it's a ring structure. If you begin at the top, the introduction, then you go down, we're looking at the right-hand side, there are a number of episodes. Adam is put into Eden, it's where he is, after he's been formed, he's put into Eden. Relationships are established between Adam and the non-human animals, and then Adam and Eve. Then the serpent asks a question. And then we get the centre of the story, where Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit. And that's the turning point. And then you start going up the other side of the diagram there, and corresponding to the serpent's question, you get God's question. In fact, there are several questions. Then relationships are ruptured. The relationship between Adam and Eve has been ruptured, and God has been ruptured by the very taking of the fruit. Then other relationships are ruptured between the individual, Adam and Eve, and themselves. They feel shame, and they feel guilt. Then the relationship between Adam and Eve is ruptured. He blames her for what has happened, and then the relationship with the serpent is ruptured, and they are driven out of the garden. Now, what might be the significance of this form? Well, this is recognised as a form that's particularly often used in folk stories. A nicely structured form like this is probably taken us back to oral tradition, where it's easy to remember a nicely formed and shaped story like this, both for the person who is the teller and also for the hearers. And also it's often used in didactic literature, in teaching form, because of course the point is in the middle. And that's giving you the teaching point here, that the point of this story is that humans are in the state we are, and the world's in the state that it is, because humans have disobeyed their creator. Now, of course, you could put an account of a historical event in this shape if you want to, but taking this with a figurative language, it may reinforce that this is to be read as a figurative, didactic, teaching story, rather than as any attempt at a historical account. But then going back again to the ancient world of the story, ancient Near East, we find it's full of cultural imagery that's common in ancient Near Eastern culture, and particularly, again, in other creation stories. The idea of a well-watered paradise is found in the literature of ancient Near East, particularly Mesopotamia. I suppose if you're in a part of the world where you're very dependent on a limited amount of rain falling at the right time in the right place, a paradise has to have lots of rain, though we in Britain aren't so keen on that. So a well-watered paradise, either by rain or by streams. Of course, in this story it is the rivers. The idea that humans are made from clay and some divine element is found, well, for Merikari is an Egyptian story. If I remember rightly there, it's a spittle of the god. Enuma Elish, it's the blood of a god, Atrahasis, which is a Mesopotamian story. Humans are made out of the blood of a god and clay. So this idea that humans are a mixture of something that's divine and the clay, the earth, of the created world is found in the other creation stories of the Fertile Crescent of that period. The imagery of the Tree of Life is very widespread. I put up Gilgamesh there, a great story, a great epic from Mesopotamia. It's a long one and I won't tell it to you now. But part of the story is Gilgamesh, who's the king of Uruk, goes looking for immortality. And he goes on a long, long journey and eventually finds the Tree of Life, and with great difficulty and struggle, in fact it's called the Plant of Life in the story, he gets this Plant of Life, and he rejoices at this fact, and he's going to go back to Uruk. He very sensibly said, I'll try it on an old man first, because this doesn't give you immortality, it rejuvenates you. But he's going to do his own health and safety testing first, before he eats it himself. But he's on his way back, he's had a hard day's travel, he's hot, he's sweating in this beautiful lake, so he puts the Plant of Life down and his clothes, and he goes for a swim, and while he's doing that, a serpent appears and eats the Plant of Life. So he's lost it. He's been deprived of it by a serpent, which of course loses its skin and rejuvenates. So he's distraught, and he goes back to Uruk weeping because he's lost his chance of a kind of immortality. And so that's where the serpent comes in. And in ancient Near Eastern literature, the serpent is a very ambiguous creature. It can be linked with wisdom, it is often linked with the occult, and sometimes linked with what is evil. So it's not just in Genesis 2 and 3 that we find that. And the idea that immortality and wisdom are two key qualities. In the Genesis 2, you've got the Tree of Life, and you've got the Tree of the Knowledge of Good and Evil. And in the certainly in the Mesopotamian literature, the difference between humans and the gods is that the gods are immortal and wise. Now humans can be wise to a degree, but humans are never immortal. That's why Gilgamesh goes hunting for immortality. You know, I have other stories like that. I mentioned the Adapa story there, because Adapa is a human who's developed great wisdom, and he is seeking immortality, because that's what will make him a god, the link of wisdom and immortality. And he is put in a situation where he's in fact is offered immortality, but because he's been tricked by one of the gods, he refuses it. So it's again asking, why aren't humans immortal? Well, the answer to that story is the gods have tricked us in some way. Why? The motivation is not made clear. But humans are not immortal. So you've got all this cultural imagery that is around, and we find it in Genesis 2 and 3, which again suggests it should be read not as a kind of scientific text, as a theological text that answering the big questions of life. Why is the world in a mess? Why aren't we like the gods? And so on. That's what it's concerned with. Again, the question, what audience? Well, as I said, this is the one question which is probably uncontroversial in answering. It's for ancient Hebrews. But let me remind you that we looked on Monday at the work of Clifford and Collins, who drew up a parallel between the main features of ancient Near Eastern creation stories, which we now have a good number, throughout the Fertile Crescent from Egypt through to Mesopotamia. They paralleled them with what they called the modern scientific story. Well, I won't put up the bits about the scientific story, but let's remind you what they said about the characteristics of ancient Near Eastern creation stories, that they imagine and present divine action on the model of human making. Well, I'm suggesting we see that in Genesis 2 and 3. God is depicted as like a potter or a sculptor. This is a model of human making that is used. It's not an attempt at the scientific answer to the question, how did humans come to be? It's using this anthropomorphic picture of God as a potter. That they present creation as a drama, a story, and Genesis 2 and 3 is a very dramatic story. But as a story, it's also very selective. It's only about certain key points because it's answering certain key existential questions. It focuses on the emergence of human society. And of course, that's what you find in Genesis 2. What's the focus? Well, the focus in the end is marriage. That's the focus of it, and that's the basis of human society as far as people of the ancient Near East are concerned. And then, of course, it focuses on the question, what's gone wrong with human society? Why is the world in a mess? And it's all about relationships, isn't it, as I've already said? Because the relationship with the Creator is ruptured, the individual's relationship with him or herself is ruptured, and that's the root of our psychological problems. There are times when we can't live with ourselves because of what we've done and what we've said or whatever. And then Adam blames Eve. We can't get on with other people. We're great at blaming other people for all our problems, and so we're hit with our social problems. And then, of course, there's the problem of the non-human world, and the ground is cursed. And that's the root of our ecological problems, that we've lost the rapport or whatever with the non-human creation. So it's a very deep analysis of the root of the problems that we face as human beings living in this world. That's what it's about. And then the criterion of truth for these accounts is a functional one. Does the story enable me to cope with some aspects of life now? We don't get the detailed answers to that in the story, but the story, as I said, is diagnosing the problems and giving you at least a beginning to get a handle on them. Of course, the basic answer is you must get right with your Creator. That's the ultimate way to cope with life, to get right with your Creator. And as someone who's worked for the last 10 years concentrating more on the Hebrew wisdom literature, of course the great thing there is that wisdom is involved in creation. Proverbs 3, Proverbs 8. And so that's one way we get back in relationship with our Creator, by discovering the wisdom which is based upon the fear of the Lord. So the Hebrew thought here is quite consistent. So that's the purpose of the story, when we look at it in its context, its incarnated context. To remind you, again, I gave you this quote on Monday from John Walton, a biblical scholar, but also a leading scholar in ancient Near Eastern literature and culture. People in the ancient world believed that something existed not by virtue of its material properties, but by virtue of having a function in an ordered system, that is, in relation to society and culture. Unlike modern science, it's not concerned with asking the question, where did matter come from, and that kind of way of looking at creation from a materialist perspective, but a functional, societal perspective. And just to remind you, I've said there's the function of marriage, based on as the basis of society, but of course the other functional system here is agriculture. That Adam and Eve were put in the garden to till it, to look after it, to care for it. And that's very important. And perhaps I might say something that is often misunderstood about Genesis 2. Adam is asked to name the animals. God brings the animals to Adam. And that's often seen as human dominating the non-human creation. But a very careful study of naming in the Old Testament done by a Roman Catholic scholar, name's suddenly gone, it'll come back to me. But the point he makes is when you look at namings throughout the Hebrew Bible, the point of them is not gaining control or domination, because in fact a good number of namings come when something is lost. You lose control. The story of the loss of the ark, there's that poor child who gets named Ichabod by his mother, which means the glory has departed. So naming isn't saying, good, we've got control of the ark, it's saying, disaster, we've lost it. When Isaac loses some wells, control of some wells to the Philistines, he names them Strife one of his names Strife, I forget the other one is called. But again, he's lost control. So Ramsey is the name of the scholar, G. Ramsey. Ramsey sums it up by saying naming, certainly in the Hebrew Bible, is about discernment of a situation. The name is given to summarise the nature of that situation. So what's going on in Genesis 2 with the naming the animals? Well, it's to enable Adam to discern that there is no satisfactory partner for him. God has seen that. You know, we've had several times in Genesis 1, it is good, and then it is very good. And if you read the whole story through, the next thing you get is God saying it's not good. What's not good? There's not a suitable partner for Adam. And Adam has to be brought to that discernment point. And so the animals are brought to him not so he can gain control of them, but he can discern their natures and realise there is none that is a suitable partner. And so when Eve is finally made and brought to him, it breaks out with a piece of love poetry. This is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Great, I've got a suitable partner now. And the important thing is she's not made out of another lump of dust, because then you have two different sorts of humanity. She's made out of part of the side, it's actually really its side, made out of the side of Adam, because we share a common humanity as male and female, and are suitable partners for one another. And that's the point of the story. So again, it's about understanding functions in the system, in this case the function of male and female. Well, what's the purpose of the story? Well, again, I want to suggest to you that its purpose was to provide the Hebrews with a true understanding of the nature and purpose of human beings in contrast to pagan ideas. The ideas they were meeting around them with the Canaanites and the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians and the other cultures with which they were interacting. And first of all, that humans are not God's slaves, but God's representatives. Very different understanding of humans. In the Mesopotamian stories, why are humans made? Well, very briefly, after the initial creation, someone's got to look after this world, and the junior gods are put in charge of looking after the world, and provide the senior gods with houses, temples, food, drink, sacrifices, and so on. So for 6,000 years, the teenagers have to work hard to provide the senior gods, and after 6,000 years they get fed up, and you get the first union strike in Bristol, and they down tools. And so what are the gods going to do? Well, the senior god in the Faraday story is Marduk, but he consults the god of wisdom, they are, and so I've got this great idea. We will make the black-headed people, and we will put the burden of the gods upon them. They will bear the yoke of the gods. So out of clay, with the help of the midwife goddess, they make pairs of humans. And humans are made to be the slaves of the gods. That's why humans are here. That's their story. And it's a very different one from the Hebrew story, where humans are made to be the representative of God, image of God on earth, to be God's co-workers in continuing the shaping of the creation, put in the garden for that purpose. Partner, yeah. To partner with God in that work. So it's a very different status and understanding of human nature and human role. And alongside that, humans are created to have fellowship with God. That beautiful picture in Genesis 3, walking with God in the garden in the cool of the day. Nothing like that in the other creation stories. And a point that's worth making here, it's been made particularly by somebody who's been a colleague of mine when I was teaching in Bristol for a while, Gordon Wenham, a leading evangelical Old Testament scholar, and he makes this point about Eden. The Garden of Eden, he says, is not viewed by the author of Genesis simply as a piece of Mesopotamian farmland, but as an archetypal sanctuary. That is, a place where God dwells and where man should worship him. Many of the features of the garden may also be found in later sanctuaries, particularly the tabernacle or Jerusalem temple. And he points out a number of things. First of all, I mentioned the rivers earlier, the rivers that flow from the garden. Well, the temple in Jerusalem was built above the Gihon spring. And this is common in ancient Eastern sanctuaries. They're linked with water. And you've got this big bronze sea of water in the temple forecourt, which is used for ablutions and other things. But water is very important as part of the sanctuary. Everything in the sanctuary is coated with gold. Painted with gold, and we're talking about the Garden of Eden, the rivers flow through land where there is gold. The priest's vestments have gold and jewels, and again there are jewels in the area around Eden. And there are cherubim, because when they're thrown out of the garden, it's guarded by cherubim. And you've got cherubim guarding the Ark of the Covenant in the temple, and you've got it embroidered on the cloths that are used in both tabernacle and temple. You've got the tree of life as well. The menorah is, I think, rightly seen as a stylized tree of life. So all these things that are in the garden are symbols in the temple and in the tabernacle. And so he said Eden is presented to us an archetypal sanctuary where you meet with God, where you meet with your Creator. And he draws an interesting implication of that. He says, if the Garden of Eden story is meant to be interpreted symbolically in terms of later cultic legislation, it's a sanctuary where you live with God, and living with God means you must know God's laws. The divine threat, in the day you eat of it you shall die, which is said to Adam in chapter 2, should be interpreted symbolically. According to later cultic ritual, the sanctuary was the centre of life, because that's where God is present. And that's part of the symbolisation of the water flowing out, taking life. You get that, of course, in Ezekiel's great vision, in Ezekiel's prophecy of the trip of the water, the river of life, flowing out of the restored temple. According to later cultic ritual, the sanctuary was the centre of life because there God was present. To be excluded from the camp of Israel was to enter the realm of death. So when Moses in Deuteronomy offers or re-offers the covenant to Israel on the edge of the promised land, he says, I offer you life and death. Well, what's he offering? Well, to live in the covenant in relationship to God is life. To live outside the covenant, you're physically alive, but you are dead, because you're out of contact with your Creator. So death is not just the event at the end of physical life. Death is something much bigger. It's about your spiritual relationship with God. And to be cut off from God is to be dead in a very important sense. And now, from a Christian point of view, I'd say, do you remember John's Gospel? A number of times Jesus says that he's the source of life. He said, anyone who believes for me will never die. Well, since then, millions of believers in Jesus have died. Jesus isn't talking about physical death. He's talking about what's often called spiritual death, spiritual life and death. So, he says the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden was, in the narrator's view, the real fulfillment of the divine sentence. Many scholars have puzzled and written large amounts on, did God lie? Was the serpent right, etc.? Because God says to Adam, the day you eat of it, you shall die. Well, the day you eat of it, he and Eve, they don't drop dead, not physically. But their relationship with their Creator is destroyed.
9 out of 30 years.
Yeah, exactly. In the story, it goes on to live over 130 years. And the point is, it's not about physical death. It's about spiritual death, being cut off from the ultimate source of life, your Creator. Of course, they're also cut off from the tree of life, so they cannot eat that to be rejuvenated or whatever the symbolism is there. Well, coming back to what's the purpose, because I talked about two purposes. Humans, not God's slaves, but God's representatives. Humans created to have fellowship with God. The third point I want to make is it's saying human plight is the result of sin. Why is the world in a mess? I've answered that question to some degree. You say, what can we do about it? Where you said the point of the story was a mess because we're not living in the right relationship with our Creator. We have to get back to that right relationship, which in the Hebrew context is going to be the covenant and the covenant law. And that's what is going to be the beginning of the way back. There's no real answer to that question. What's the reason for the human plight in the other creation story? We know. I said they're very enigmatic about it, or in the end it just seems to come back to the whim of the gods. The gods decide humans are not going to be immortal, and one particular god decides that they're fed up. For instance, Enlil gets fed up that there are so many, these black-headed people. There's so many of these black-headed people, and they are so noisy he can't sleep. So he decides he's going to wipe them out, and he sends plagues and other things, and that doesn't work, so he sends a flood, and so on. So there's no simple answer, no straightforward answer to the question, what's the reason for the mess we're in? Just got to walk carefully and tread carefully and make sure you don't upset any of the gods, and so on. The answer in the Hebrew tradition is it comes back to sin, to disobedience of the Creator. And in a sense, that's a hopeful answer, because there is a way back. There is a way back. Extra biblical evidence, just to remind you of Calvin's quote again. I didn't say much about this last time, if anything. The interesting thing is that Calvin had what's called a strong doctrine of the fallenness of humans, that sinfulness has affected every part of the human character, personality, including the human mind. So there are times when we tend to not accept the truth when it's blatantly obvious in front of us and so on. But he had a strong doctrine of what's called common grace, that God is still at work in the world, God still loves humans, and the Spirit of God is at work in the world, and anyone seeking truth, genuinely seeking truth, will have the help of the Spirit of God to find it. And so that's why Calvin said, we don't just live in a Christian ghetto and only think about what Christians say. We must listen to truth wherever it is found. Because if people are honestly seeking the truth, they will be led to it, in as far as they are led to it by the Spirit of God. They will be offending the Spirit of God if we don't listen to non-Christian scholars and other people and see what they have discovered about God's world and so on. So as well as the background evidence from the ancient Near Eastern culture that I've been talking about, it is relevant to take into account information from other sources of studies, and I'll come back to that in a moment, just a little bit. But I want to say two other things before homing in for the last few seconds or minutes of my presentation to science. First, some general points about figurative literature. To say a text is intended to be read as figurative literature is not to say that there may not be a historical event behind it. So I know some of you might ask the question, well, you know, was there historical Adam and Eve? And if you want to ask that, I may or may not attempt to answer it. But that is a question you can ask of figurative literature. Is this figurative story about some event? It could be. But what I do want to say, it means we must be very cautious of any attempt to get through the figurative account to what's behind it, because its purpose is to convey theology, not science. And so to ask scientific questions of it is to ask the wrong sort of questions, and may lead you to the wrong sort of answers, and indeed stupid answers. It's there to answer your theological questions, not your scientific questions. If I may draw a parallel for a moment from the Christian scriptures, in Revelation 12, in the last book of the New Testament, there is a very symbolic story about a woman who's dressed in red, and she's got the sun behind her, and 12 planets, the 7 planets around her and the moon, and she's in agony of childbirth, and there's a great red dragon waiting to devour the child when the child is born. When the child is born, it's caught up the heavens, so the serpent, the dragon, which is also called a serpent, doesn't devour it. What on earth is going on here? Well, it's a mixture of imagery from Hebrew tradition and Hellenistic tradition. Because in Isaiah, you've got the picture of the Messianic community. So Isaiah 26, if I remember rightly, the Messianic community is a woman in the agonies of childbirth, crying out because she cannot produce a child. She just produces wind. So where is the Messiah? Why is the Messiah not coming? All down through our history, we've been waiting for Messiah. So there's that imagery. But also in the Hellenistic tradition, you've got the myth of Apollo's birth. Because Apollo is the sun god and the great healer and saviour god. And before he's born, there's a prophecy that he will kill Seth, or I can't remember, Seth is in the Egyptian Hellenized form of it, the dragon who symbolises the forces of evil. And so that dragon wants to prevent him being born. And when his mother is in childbirth, the dragon is trying to be around to get hold of the Apollo when he's born, but fails. So why, I would come from Christian, speaking as a Christian, I say, why does God inspire this Christian apocalyptic writer to use that combination of imagery? Well, because this is in the latter part of the 1st century, and it was earlier in the 1st century that the Caesars started depicting themselves as Apollo. You can see it on their coins, that they are represented as if they are Apollo, because Apollo is the saviour god. And one way they represent it is you have Apollo as a sun god with the rays of the sun coming out of the back of his head. it looks very as if he's wearing a crown of thorns. So for Christians, there's another significance in that crowning of Jesus, the pretender, as from the Roman point of view, pretender to be a king, is crowned with thorns. See, the Caesars are saying, we are your saviours. And of course they begin to demonize themselves, which they haven't done before. You worship Caesar, which hadn't been done before around Augustus kind of arrived. And so it is a challenge to the imperial religion, which is saying worship Caesar as God. And no, says the vision in Revelation 12, it is Jesus who is the Saviour God, not Caesar. Very political piece of imagery. But from that, if that's all we knew about, from a Christian point of view, is the incarnation and the work of Jesus, we could never say he was born in the reign of Caesar Augustus, in the procuratorship of so and so. So that information we're given in Luke's Gospel, you could never get back to that from the figurative story. I'm suggesting we might well be in the same situation with the creation story in Genesis 2 and 3. So, and then this question did come up on Monday. I'm saying it seems to me that using literary analysis, you get a clear change of genre at the end of chapter 11. We enter a new world. We're in a symbolic world in Genesis 1 to 11. At the end of 11, the form of literature changes, and we get into the world that's recognisably the world of the ancient Near East, round about the beginnings of the 2000 BC or thereabouts. Finally, I mentioned some of this on Monday. Why is the poetic imagery drawn from the culture around? Because that gives it power. It's a succinct way of expressing ideas and a powerful way of expressing ideas using imagery drawn from the culture. It doesn't imply that the stories from which the imagery comes are being accepted, or the ideology of those stories is being accepted by those who are using the imagery. Indeed, they may use the imagery to subvert or oppose that ideology or theology, and I've suggested that's what's happening in Genesis 1 to 3. The imagery from the culture is drawn to convey certain ideas and make certain points, but very often in opposition to what the points were in the original stories from which they are taken. Let's say briefly something about science before I finish. There's a question that philosophers and historians of science in the West began to ask at the start of the 20th century. Why was it in Western civilization alone among the cultures of the world that science in its modern sense developed? Peter Harrison referred to this in his presentation on Monday. That question was being asked then because at the end of the 19th century we had what was called the conflict thesis grew up, which he talked about, that science and religion have always been in conflict with one another, and it's part of the nature of religion and science that they are in conflict. But if that's true, why was it in late medieval Europe, which was a very religious society, in which Christian theology and the Judeo-Christian tradition permeated the society, well, why did religion arise in that setting? Why did science arise? Thank you. Well, the answer they gave was one of the important things that is a contributor. It's not the whole answer by any means. Peter stressed this, but one important contributor to the rise of science, or the failure of the rise of science, is the worldview of a culture. And I go back to Mesopotamia, which I know reasonably well. They did tremendous work on observational astronomy, and there were tremendous developments in mathematics alongside that, so that they could describe in mathematical terms the movement of the heavenly bodies, particularly the sun, moon, and the 5 visible planets. But it did not develop or kick off modern astronomy. What happened instead? We got astrology. Why? Because they understood the moving planets as manifestations of gods. And what you get instead of modern astronomy is you get books and books of astronomical omens, because they believed the gods were talking to them by the movement of the planets. And it's from that we get horoscopic astrology eventually via the Greeks who took it over. So the world view is what, to some extent, determines what you do with your observations of the world. The difference in Western Europe at the time, Many historians contend that one important factor, it's only one factor, but it's an important one, was the tacit attitude toward nature engendered by a unique combination of Greek and biblical ideas. But what are these biblical ideas? To sum them up very briefly, because you see this in the creation stories we've been looking at, there's a self-existent creator, in the beginning God, and this is, people often ignore the fact that you get a great deal, in some ways, fuller creation theology in Isaiah 40 to 55. That there we see a self-existent creator. I am he, there is no other. A rational creator? Well, the biblical word in the Hebrew Bible is wise. I've mentioned that wisdom in Proverbs. So you've got a rational creator. And it's a planned and ordered creation. Genesis 1 makes that very clear. Well, there are implications you can draw from that, and the early modern scientists did draw them quite explicitly. Therefore, there are laws of nature. Peter Harrison referred to this, and Descartes, and so on. But the concept of laws of nature arises at that time, and it has a biblical background. I'll talk about this in more detail in my chapter in the book edited by Dennis Alexander, Can We Know Anything? Can we be sure about anything? But then humans are made in the image of God, in the image and likeness of God. And that's vitally important, because that's why we can understand the laws. Back to that quote we had several times, and we had it today, brothers yesterday, from Einstein. The only incomprehensible thing about the universe is it's comprehensible. You know, if we are just chance random products of an impersonal cosmos, why should our minds be able to produce these wonderful mathematical constructions that then turn out to be descriptions of the universe at very deep levels? Well, Kepler's answer, who cried out when he studied the orbits of planets and came up with the ellipses, "Oh God, I am thinking your thoughts after you." And why was he doing that? Well, he explicitly refers to Proverbs 8 and to Genesis 1 in that part of Harmony Mundi. He has got a biblical concept, but he is made in the image of the Creator. And that's what kept him going for 5 years, doing, as we know, over 70 different calculations. This is on back of envelopes, not on computers, in order to find out what was the right shape for the orbit. And creation was a free act of God. Again, this was stressed by David yesterday. And therefore, you have to go and look. You can't sit down and have a seminar to decide what's the shape of the orbit of Mars. You've got to go and do your observations, and you come up with observations that just don't fit a circle, despite 2,000 years of tradition from Aristotle onwards. It isn't a circle, because it doesn't match the observations. So Kepler spends 5 years trying to find what it is, its limits. I see I'm running out of time. The Hebrew, which is the standard text nowadays of the Hebrew Bible, doesn't say in the beginning. It says in the beginning. Now, those of you who know Hebrew will say, yeah, you only know that because the Masoretic text has vowel points in it. And they weren't used until about 700 AD, so how do we know how it was read before? Well, because in 250 BC or thereabouts, Jewish scholars translated the Torah into Greek in Alexandria, and Greek's got a perfectly clear word for the, and it's not used. It just says in beginning. And for those of us who are Christians, John's Gospel begins. In beginning was the word, not in the beginning. Now, this is a bit disputed, but I would suggest that this points to the fact that, that in the thinking in Hebrew thought, they were well aware that the important thing about creation is not chronology, when it was created, it's about ontology. Why is there a world at all? That's what this is really grasping after. It doesn't matter if you can date when it happened, but the big question is, why is it there at all? It's an existential question. And it was in the Judeo-Christian tradition, particularly in the Jewish tradition, that you first get the idea of creation out of nothing as a way of getting at this point. It's in 2 Maccabees, a book written probably about 100 BC, but we have the first clear statement of what's now called creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. God made them, that's the heaven and the earth, out of things that did not exist. And that's taken up by Christian thinkers, we find in Hebrews, by faith we understand the worlds were prepared by the word of God, clearly back to Genesis 1, that so that what is seen is made from things that are not visible. What's not visible? Well, the word of God. God speaks. That's not something visible. and then we have a visible world. Something out of nothing. What's important about that? Well, it is saying two important things. It is saying that that only God is self-existence. Everything else, there was a time when everything else wasn't there. The Christian way of putting it later was there was when it was not. It didn't say there was a time when it was not. There was when it was not. Because as Augustine said, God created the world with time. Time is part of the created order, not in time, because time didn't exist until God created the world. Sort of foreshadowing of Einstein there. So the important thing is that only God is immortal, self-existent, and so on. Everything else is totally dependent upon God, but it is not an emanation from God, which is one Greek way of thinking about it. The material world is not sort of some part of God's nature or substance. It is something that did not exist until God brought it into being. That's the important thing about the doctrine of pre-apocalypse, that the material world is totally dependent upon God for its existence. It's not derived from God. It's not something that existed ever alongside God. It's something that God brought into being, and only remains as long as God sustains it. And you've got the idea in later Jewish literature of wisdom sustaining the world, and in Christian traditions, Christ who sustains the world. And that's recognised, or at least the fact that there is this question, why is there anything at all, is a vital question, recognised by some scientists who are not believers are not believers in theism of any form. Martin Rees got mentioned by David yesterday, and his comment is the preeminent mystery is why anything exists at all. What breathes life into the equations of physics and actualises them in the real cosmos? Such questions lie beyond science. However, they are the province of philosophers and theologians. What he's saying here is, well, where do all those laws come from that we use? We have to presume that they're there, and then we find them. Why is we presume matter is there? We can't say where matter came from. The methodology of science is a material methodology dealing with matter and energy, and we can never get back beyond that. We can only go back to some state of matter and energy, maybe a quantum vacuum. But the quantum vacuum is not a nothing. It's a very complex time of energy field. So where does it all come from? He said, well, science can't answer that question. So science cannot arbitrate on the question of whether this is a created universe. It can only say, well, that's a question that's beyond our abilities. In the strict sense, it's a metaphysical question. A question that goes beyond physics. Cannot be answered by physics. Some people think that Genesis 2 verse 7, this story about God forming man from the dust of the ground by breathing into his nostrils the breath of life, and man becomes a living being, suggests there's something special about the creation of humans. Not so, if you read the story, because a few verses later we are told that all these animals that are brought to Adam so he can discern their nature, that they are made out of the dust of the ground, and they are living beings. They are nefesh chaya. So they're exactly the same nature as Adam. And later, when we have the flood, all the creatures that Noah takes into the ark, they have in them the nishmat chayim. They have the breath of life in them. So there's nothing in that story to say there's anything different about the way humans are brought into being. They are, in that sense, we are like the rest of sentient creation. Our specialness doesn't lie in how God made us, but the relationship God offers us and the task that God gives us. We're made in God's image. I won't expand on this. We've talked about this to some degree already. We are representatives of God's earth. But just finally, to say something about this verb bara, to create. It's used of humans. In 127, it's used at the beginning and end of the story. I mentioned this last time. And then it's used of the great sea monsters. I made the point that that is to do with the imagery of cosmos, of chaos monsters. Again, it is saying to us that there's not anything special about how humans are created, using this verb, because it's used of the whole creation. It's used particularly of chaos monsters as well. The important thing is that human specialness rests in how God has made us, not how God made us, but the relationship he gives with himself and the task he gives us. So if you want to relate Genesis 1, 2 and 3 to science, I don't think we can do it through the details of the story in the text. don't look at details of the story in the text and say, how can I correlate that with science? It has to be done through the theology of the text. What is the theology of the text saying, and how do I relate that to modern science? And that raises, well, it raises the question, is this a created universe? It raises the question, well, what is special about humans if it's not about how the way we are made? And what does it mean to say we're in the image of God? And these are answers you'll not get from science. You can't look at bone structures to find out what it means to be made in the image of God, because God is spirit, and not made of bone and flesh as we are, and so on. So it raises questions that theological issues. How do we relate that to the scientific story? And I guess that's partly the job of the scientist to tell us, and that's why you're here. But I will stop there. Sorry, I've run over a little bit.
Thank you very much, Ernest, and you hang on for every word, so we don't mind you going over. But I'm sure that there are questions. So who's going to go first? Yes, at the front here, George has a question.
Thanks for the talk. I was just wondering what you make of the various characters in the stories being given quite specific ages, even in those first 11 chapters. And also what you make of, you mentioned how the Mesopotamians had a story about a flood as well, and how does that relate in some way to the Noah story?
Well, those two questions, I think, are in fact to be answered together, because it is significant. We have this flood story from Mesopotamia in more than one version: Sumerian version, Babylonian version, Syrian version. I'm sure what that points to is behind this story, which I see again as a symbolic story, but behind this story is a real historical event. And there's been all sorts of speculations about what historical flood might have been. Can we correlate with anything that geology or archaeology shows us? So I think that's a real event. And then the question is, when some event like that happens, how do you interpret its significance? And Babylonians have their way of interpreting its significance. Humans are far too noisy, far too disorganised, and in the end, the chief god decided he's got to wipe them out. One of the gods has got a soft spot for Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, and decides to save his favourite human being, and so on. And we've got the biblical account of the story. Interestingly, what comes out of the Babylonian story is a particular ideology. It's very much a temple-based, stratified ideology. You must have a class society with the priests at the top to make sure you don't upset the gods, and the rest of humanity is there to serve the priests, and so on. So you get an ideology out of it. You get an ideology out of it in Genesis, which is about our relationship to God, and there is a theological ideology that comes from the story. So, this is a case, I think, of a figurative story that has almost certainly has a historical event behind it. But getting back to that event, I don't think anyone's come up with a satisfactory answer to that yet. They may do. What about the numbers, the ages? Well, in the Sumerian tradition, there's what are called the Sumerian king lists. In these king lists, the name tells you what they're about. It gives the reigns of kings, and there are 8 to 10 kings who lived before the flood, and then after the flood there are more kings who lived after the flood. Particularly some of the kings after the flood, we know they're real people, because there is archaeological evidence, indeed inscriptions about them. One of them in particular, Enlil-Bagisi, we know he was a real king, and we know he lived for a normal length of time. But in the king list, he lives, I think it's something like 900 or 1,000 years. Well, he reigns for 900 or 1,000 years. And when you go before the flood, whereas in the Hebrew tradition you've got hundreds of years, you've got tens of thousands of years these kings reign before the flood, and after the flood they start off with pretty lengthy reign. What is this saying to us? I think it's saying to us that the numbers are part of the figurativeness of the story. Numbers are being used in a figurative way. A kind of it, the numbers are not being used numerologically. Numerically, the numbers are being used symbolically to say something. Perhaps the most obvious thing is life was a lot better before the flood. Things have got worse since. And maybe that's part of the significance of the numbers in the Hebrew tradition. So I would say that the numbers here are being used in a symbolical way. The trouble is, both with the Sumerian list and with the biblical list, we haven't got the key to the symbolism, I don't think. It's saying something, but we're not quite sure what it is saying. And I'm pretty sure one thing it is saying is, don't try to calculate when God created Adam out of these numbers. Of course, Archbishop Usher did, and got, I forget why he put it in October, but it was a particular date in October of 4004 BC. I think it's related to phase now moon, actually. And so anyway.
Yes, Martin. Along you, that's right, yeah. Oh, Samuel, sorry.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I wish we could hear more and more from you. I have a question, although there are so many doubts which I was having, and I was able to get answered to that, and especially when we talk about theology of the text. I don't want to go more in that, but I just wanted to hear from you that when we talk about Genesis chapter 1 especially, and there is an order of creation given, and when we talk about Big Bang Theory and evolution, they have also made an order of that. So how they are, like, are they similar, or in the way they are being proposed or placed?
Okay, thank you.
Or any difference?
I did suggest on Monday that the order in Genesis is this order of shaping and filling, and I suggest that Watson gives us a key to understanding why those three shaping actions are mentioned, because they are to do with functional systems that are basic to human life on Earth. The light and dark system on day 1, the weather system on day 2, and the agricultural system on day 3. And I don't see that it has any correlation with the scientific story through Big Bang or through evolution. In fact, those who try to find the parallels, I think, run into problems. You've got plant-bearing, seed-bearing plants on day 3 before you've got any life in the sea or on the land, and that just doesn't fit the evolutionary story, as I understand. I'm not a biologist or a paleontologist, but you don't get flowering plants until very late on in the story, evolutionary story. Also, you've got birds flying across the firmament on day 3 before you've got land animals. And as we understand it, birds have evolved from dinosaurs. So once you had land animals and dinosaurs, you can't have birds flying across the firmament. So it's not about the same story. The story is not asking or answering the same sort of question. So I personally wouldn't attempt any correlation, because to quote Maimonides, as I said earlier, if you try and do that, I think you get an absurdity. But it's got wonderful truth, wonderful wisdom in it. You treat it as a theological story.
I'm going to go to the back of the room now. There are 2 questions there.
I wonder if you have given any thought to comparisons between the biblical story and other religions. I'm thinking about Aboriginal religion stories, creation stories. There's a wonderful one from Australia where the ancestors formed the humans and the animals out of rocks and trees and plants, and there's a fascinating way in which humans are connected to the natural environment. In fact, some people have suggested that we should listen to these Aboriginal stories to restore our ecological connections. Now, do you see a difference between the way the biblical account has depicted this conception of humanity and other religious conceptions?
My simple answer to your question is no, I haven't given much thought to other religions. I've read a little bit in the Jewish tradition, I've read even less in the Islamic tradition. Beyond that, no. Life is just too short. When you're teaching biblical studies in a British university context with all the academic administration that goes with it, you have limited time. So from that point of view, I can't answer your question. I mean, I can fully accept that it's worth asking sort of looking at the theology, ideology, whatever you want to call it, of these other stories, because we may well be able to learn important truths from them as to how they see humans related to the rest of creation and so on. So I can see it as a valuable thing to do from any perspective, but no, I personally haven't done anything.
I like very much you calling the garden an archetypal sanctuary, rather than an agro-ecosystem, a piece of Mesopotamian land, or an ecosystem as we see it. So if we think about that, do you not think the Christian tradition gets into some difficulties when we read and discuss the new earth, the new creation, the new heaven, and we get locked into very anthropomorphic and earth-centric visions, and especially the idea that not only man fell, but the whole ecosystem fell, and then suddenly had predators and prey and parasites and diseases and things that it didn't have before. Now, no ecosystem that we know of in the fossil record or anywhere else has ever worked like that. And I think we stretch our credibility as Christians if we witness that to other people who know how ecology works. So could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, a very good question, Andy. I'm going to say a tremendous amount about it. I'll try to be brief without time for the question. You make a very valid point, and I think for those of us who've grown up in the English-speaking world, our view of Eden is influenced as much and perhaps more by that great poem by John Milton, Paradise Lost, than it is by actually the text of Genesis 2 and 3. And we need to go back to that text. One of the important things in that text that is often not picked up is when God says to, well, we're told in verse 15 of chapter 2, the Lord God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to tend it. Now the two verbs that are used there, to till and to tend, could be translated to serve and preserve. It says the idea of we're not, again, dominating, we are serving the rest of creation. Exactly, yes. And preserve not in a museum type sense, but keeping the goodness of it, because we've been told it's so good in the first chapter. And indeed, those two verbs are never, the only other place where those two verbs are used together is in the Torah when speaking of the work of the priests and the Levites in the tabernacle. So again, you've got imagery of the sanctuary. So it's a religious activity of obedience, of worship to God, to look after the world properly. That's the theology that comes out of it to me. I think it's tremendously important ecologically. And you're right, if you again, it's going from Milton rather than from the Bible, that you then try to say, well, before the fall, there was no predation, no death, etc., etc. Clearly at odds with the scientific evidence, because it's not the story is not about that, and that's a wrong kind of way to try to, I'm saying, not looking at the theology, but trying to relate the details of the text. What the text is saying, when you talk about the ground being cursed and thistles and so on, is saying, yes, our relationship with the rest of creation is not what it should be. It's gone wrong. And we cannot serve the creation as we should, because we're not in the right relationship with the Creator. And it's to ignore other texts, like I mentioned Psalm 104 on Monday, which is a great creation psalm with a lot of similarity to Genesis 1. Within that psalm, it is God who gives the young lions their prey. So predation is seen as a gift of God. It's not the evil. So you've got to take that into your theology if you're going to take it seriously. I think I'd like to say one other thing, which is a bit of a spin-off from what you said. The sanctuary imagery. People quite often, when I talk in churches, say, well, what kind of language is Genesis 1? Is it poetry? The simple answer is no, it's not classical Hebrew poetry, but it's not classical Hebrew prose either. It's halfway between. It's what's often called elevated prose. It's got some elements, and there is a piece of genuine Hebrew poetry in that verse about the creation of humans. But in many cultures where you have got a prose poetry distinction, elevated prose is often the language of worship. It's the language of liturgy. And again, that's led scholars to suggest that the origin of Genesis 1 is as a worship text. And that it ends on the seventh day when you worship. They point that way. It's also pointed out in the other creation, some of the other creation stories, certainly in Canaanite story about Baal, in the story about Marduk. At the end of creation, the other gods build a house, a temple for Marduk. So creation ends with the building of a temple for the creator God. Well, you don't get that in Genesis 1, but maybe is that because the whole cosmos is the temple? for the Creator God who rests. And where do gods rest? They rest in their temple. So, again, that's sanctuary imagery, maybe more just in chapter 3.
Just like to make, hello? I'd just like to make two short comments. First of all, much of what you said is corresponds to the Kabbalah of the Jewish mysticism, the creation of the and all that fits very well. And then your statement about names tell you about the circumstances. And the excellent example of that is the names of the children of Jacob, the 12 names, and each one, the name tells you what the wife thinks about her circumstances. Exactly.
Thank you. That's a very good example. Yeah. Yeah.
Any more questions? Can you put your hands up high so I can see them? Yes, right at the very back there. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a question. I just wonder where in Genesis 2, is that working?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just wondering where in Genesis 2 to 3 you see humanity as having a representative role, and what kind of sense that would make if the garden, in some sense, represents the temple. If God's there walking in the garden, why does humanity need to represent him? And conversely, once they're cast out of the garden, with that relationship ruptured, how could that work?
Well, if you say where is the, I mean, I think we have to take Genesis 2 and 3 with Genesis 1. I see them as different stories in one sense, but they have been put together because they illuminate one another. You know, again, so often if we see two accounts of something, I know our Western minds is to say, you know, where do they differ? Where do they contradict one another or whatever? No, I think they're put together because they complement each other. And so you've got the strong statements of representativeness of humans at the end of Genesis 1, made in the image and likeness of God. But I think that is then implied in that verse I've already referred to in 2:15. They are there to serve and preserve God's creation. And that's where Adam is put as God's representative in the garden to look after it. And God coming and walking in the garden is a part, it's a bit like, how I use the sort of very classist British background, it's a bit like the Lord of the Manor or the Lord of the estate coming to his steward of his estate at the end of the day and saying, well, let's talk over what you've done today, shall we? Give me that sort of picture. So that, I think it's in the story concept, it's there in Adam and Eve serving and preserving the garden. It's not expressed as sharply or clearly as in Genesis 1, but in a sense it exegetes Genesis 1. What is one of the ways in which we represent God? How do we work out this dominion, rule and dominion? Well, I think it's there in 2:15 and in what follows. When humans are cast out, and then in the Christian tradition, there's been a lot of debate about that. Did humans lose the image of God when they were cast out of Eden? What happened there? I think the answer is no, they don't lose it, because later on, in chapter 5, I think, where we are told that Adam's children have the image of Adam, who was made in the image of God. So the image role, the representative role, continues even in maybe a distorted form in humans. It's not lost, it is still there. And if the image is, I mean, one way it's been expressed in the Christian tradition, if the heart of the image is relationship with God, which implies we have to have a certain nature such that we can have a relationship with God, and if we're to image God as representatives, there must be something about human personality that can reflect something of the character of God. We can be wise, we can be loving, we can be faithful, and so on. But as fallen human beings, to use the Christian language, that relationship is ruptured, so it's a distorted image that is there, but it can be restored. And again, it's not often recognised by Christians that there's a lot of language in the New Testament about the Christ being the image of the Father or the image of God, and that the work of the Spirit is to restore, is to make us Christ-like. So what does that mean? Restoring the image of God to what it ought to be. And in a lot of Christianity I know, that aspect of what we're meant to be happening to us as Christians is lost, that we're meant to be restored to our image of God. And why? So we can serve and preserve the creation. There's a whole theology to be unwrapped there about Christian discipleship.
Laura.
I think I may have had a light bulb moment when you said in beginning as opposed to in the beginning. So Genesis, I'm understanding, is not actually really a chronological creation account, but setting up the store as our God's purpose in us, and then explaining how we fell into sin and corrupted our relationship, which pervaded everything else, and then the rest of the Bible really is an explanation of how God is bringing us back into right relationship.
Yeah, I mean, you can repeat the word hallelujah. Yes, it's very satisfying when someone gets a light bulb moment and it leads to the same vision as I had when I tried to convey. Yeah, I fully agree with what you said.
Okay, on that note, I think we'll break down for coffee. Let's thank Ernest again.